Hi there, it's Pastor Matthew of Rivers of Life Community Church here in Ashford. And this week we are continuing on in our studies in the Gospel of Mark. We are now in chapter 10, and this week we're going to be looking at verses 1 to 12, which in my version of the NIV is entitled Divorce. Now this carries on from last week, where the message only delivered in the church itself here in South Willsborough, and that was looking at continuing on with the more teaching about being childlike in faith, the simplicity of that fresh relationship with Jesus, or even as a little child, because the picture also paints a picture of having a child on his lap. Also paints a picture of a young believer on the lap of Jesus. And in both contexts, both could be derided, the physical child or the spiritual child. And so that concludes the kind of phase of teaching. Although, ironically, next week we might be looking at this again, in the fact that next week we're going to be looking at the little children in Jesus, because that's the next section. Because the childlike image actually is quite a powerful theme. This week we are looking at more teaching. So basically Jesus has moved on, he's moved further south into Israel, and he's crossed to Jordan. It says verse 1. I need to actually pause here for a moment and say, so if you want to read this text, you can pause the video here and read your own Bible, or from verses 1 through to 12 in chapter 10 of Mark's Gospel, or you can hit the link in the description box and read it from there. And there will be some other links in that description box where there are relevant scriptures to this study this morning. So what do we find? Verse 1, as I say, he's crossed to Jordan. So we're in the southern Israel, and again we've got more crowds. Now, just to paint a picture here, this region was Herod's region, and we'll have a look at why that's important in a minute, because that sets the scene for the question that Jesus is going to get asked in verse 2. But it's that appreciation that yet again we have in a completely different narrative to the other areas before, where he fed masses of people or dealt with demons that no one else but him could deal with, it seemed, or all these sort of things, teaching them, feeding them. But this is now somewhere else, continuing to teach people. So it's more crowds, more teaching. But of course, we now also, as seems to be a commonplace across the region, more pesky Pharisees, more asking more awkward questions, more questions where all they want to do is not get an answer, but to trap Jesus. Because what was this question about? And we see this in verse 2. So it says, some Pharisees came to test Jesus. Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? So why is this a trap? So this region is the same, is basically Herod's zone. Herod, as you read in previous sections and listen to the previous videos, was the same Herod that John the Baptist came up against, because one of the things he said to Herod, you must not marry your brother Philip's wife, his wife Herodias. And what happened? So there was a birthday party, and there was high spirits, and Herod got himself in a bit of a tizzy, because he said to the girl, I'll give you anything that you want, even up to half my kingdom. What did she want? She didn't want anything more than John the Baptist's head. But this actually kind of sent shockwaves, because John the Baptist was quite a key man in that time, and even Herod knew that. So the Pharisees asking this same question of Jesus potentially puts Jesus at risk of Herod coming down and accosting Jesus and putting him to one side, just in the same way as they did with John the Baptist. So this is a hostile question in a hostile region in terms of it being Herod's zone. But as I say, it's teaching to a crowd. So this thing, it's crowds again, but hostile questions from the Pharisees in a hostile region, because it's Herod's land. So what does Jesus do? Jesus, the master of answering such questions. Because what did he do? He goes back to he actually asks them to begin with, because he's looking for common ground. Because just as much as these were Pharisees that weren't looking for a real answer, although saying that, there may be one or two on the edge who might actually pick this up and think, do you know what, he actually makes complete sense, I'll follow this guy rather than this other lot, although that could cost him quite a bit. But either way, Jesus is trying to gain common ground, so he's asking them to go back to what they understand. And so he says, what did Moses command? Because they should know. Pharisees, they're teachers of the law, and they should know what it says. And so they do quote back and saying that they said, Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. And that's a direct quote from Moses' words in Deuteronomy 24 and verses 1 through to 4, particularly the first section of that. But it's all about how Moses permitted people to, usually man, son in these cases, to write a certificate of divorce and send her away. Hence why you think it's more often the man doing this, because it's sending her away, because they find something that displeases them. Not that actually says there, they actually stop there. Moses permitted us to write a certificate of divorce. And so this is where then Jesus comes back to them and says, well, hang on. The reason for this is because, or reason why Moses wrote this is because of the fact he knew that you had hard hearts. So he says here, because your hearts were hard. And then you're thinking, hang on, Moses wrote this 100 years, but it still applies, even though it's written hundreds of years ago, it still applies to them as it still kind of applies to today. Because it's a guide as to how to treat people. And if you've got a heart that's not hard, then you have a chance to use it in the principle of the way it was written. Why was it written? Well, in reality, the world is not perfect. Ever since the fall, ever since Adam and Eve chose to go their own way by not doing as God had asked them, he gave them a whole garden, a place of perfection, and asked them just to do one thing. And with the help of Satan, they managed to fail that kind of test. And bless us that ever since then, we have all been in this same boat of hard hearts, trying to work our own ways and doing our own things. And this is where this is a teaching perhaps that shouts down through the ages. So what does Jesus do? So he goes back to before the fall. He goes back to creation. So if we were to turn to Genesis 1, verse 27, we read the pinnacle of God's creation, where it says, in verse 27 of chapter 1 in Genesis, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. Now, you will actually see that that's actually alluding to the fact that you can see in chapter 2 how God did this, because we know from the scriptures that yes, there will be male and female species around, but it wasn't until chapter 2 that we see the story of how out of Adam, first man, he created Eve. Out of Adam, God took the rib and created Eve, and then Eve became Adam's suitable helper. And so it says in chapter 2, verse 24 of Genesis. For this reason, actually I'll start from verse 23 because it actually finishes off nicely, because it says, the man said, this is now a bone of my bones, and she shall be called woman, and for she was taken out of man. And then it goes on. This is what Jesus quotes to the disciples, but particularly the Pharisees. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh. So Jesus said, from quoting this, out of two people, two counterparts, one flesh was created. So Jesus adds a little bit on this, because he says, therefore. And the therefore is therefore because of Genesis 1 and 2. What we have just read. And he says as well that therefore, verse 9, chapter 10 of Mark's Gospel. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate. What God has joined together, let man not separate. So this is about coupling and cleaving to become one flesh, two becoming one. So don't break it, because you're breaking what God's brought together. But I think here our biggest issue is what is found in verse 5, where Jesus starts his answer to them. Your problem, Pharisees. And in one way, one thing we've got to think about with these Pharisees, because sometimes we can get smug and self-righteous and thinking, I'd never be like a Pharisee. And it's actually to say, humble themselves now, and thinking there are probably shadows within me that might think a bit like a Pharisee at times, that I'm smug and self-righteous. And therefore, we are potentially in the same boat as these Pharisees of having hard hearts. And what we need to appreciate is the one that can give us a heart soft and malleable to God's hand is God himself. Because a hard heart is has impervious attitudes towards others. And in this case, with these Pharisees and in that culture, especially to women. Now, of course, that could be on a wider context. It could, in this day and age, talk to impervious attitudes towards other people. In fact, sometimes it might be just down to we feel uncomfortable around them. But it's asking, actually, in those cases, for us not to be, ask us to have courage. Ask us not to be in a position where we do damage to other people because we can't cope with them. Perhaps because we're scared of them. Asking God for courage to work with these people, whoever they may be. So today we must be aware of hard hearts, especially from these quotes of Jesus from Genesis 1 and 2. You will notice that Jesus seems through the gospel, as it were, to have find more in the way of open hearts from those who would be seemingly condemned, or certainly condemned by the smug righteous Pharisees or the like. If you don't believe me, just go through the Gospels and have a look at some of the examples, especially to women. The women at the well in John 4, of a woman caught in adultery. There's a lady also in Luke 7, and there's Mary Magdalene, who all thought to be women of disrepute, if you like. And they probably knew their position because that's the way society pushed them down. But Jesus, and just his presence, just Jesus being there, is enough to start producing some kind of open hearts in them, so that there can be a discourse between Jesus and those condemned people. Because Jesus is in the business of repairing people. He's in the business of giving us a fresh heart, clean hearts. How do we know this? Well, he had his own heart pierced on the cross. But what also do we find on the flip side? We find from these Pharisees and these teachers of the law, chief priests, their smugness, their self-righteousness brings them into a position where they are actually self-condemned. So where the captive would be set free in the presence of Jesus, those who are free become captive. Or in other ways, those who think they can see actually can't see. They're blinded by their own self-righteousness. There's only one source of righteousness, and that's through God's Son, Jesus Christ, as this comes from the Bible. Jesus has come to set us free, and it's a gift of God. It comes with no cost, no price. We just have to accept it. There's nothing barring anyone from taking it. It's just having a heart that it's not hard to be able to take it. Now, Jesus ends this section by looking at the conditions. Because Jesus then gives almost like a private viewing, as it were, to the disciples. Because they then asked them, well, in verse 10, it says, when they were in the house again, the disciples asked about Jesus about this. And Jesus answered, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And then if she divorces her husband and marries another woman, she commits adultery. So it seems there that because when you're together, someone decides to break it, it actually sparks off almost it's almost as bad as killing something, because when two come together, you're ripping that flesh apart again. So if you can imagine just as one person being ripped apart, it's a bit like that. So there's almost a scarring. There are wounds coming from that kind of scenario where the flesh two flesh that become one, then ripped apart, will have quite some wounds, and we'll need an expert physician, i.e. Jesus Christ, to heal those wounds and deal with those situations. And that's critical in itself to know that this is the thing, because you can come across these kind of scenarios where there is adultery involved or divorce involved, and the right course of action in those circumstances comes about through prayer, comes about through petitioning Jesus to intervene, petitioning Jesus to ask to see, well, how can we put this right? How can we heal these wounds? Because at the end of the day, what we want to see is that each one of us become a trophy of God's grace in our life, that grace given to us at a great cost and a great price through his death and resurrection. A great price, as I said before, with his wounds and with piercing his heart, Jesus, okay, he was dead by that time, but it's in one way, his heart was broken because of the sin that was upon him on the cross. And so in one way, where you could almost argue that Jesus was cleaved to God, he knew what it was like to be ripped apart from Father because of the sin that tore them apart. So he understood what it is when two had become together in one flesh, to be ripped apart, leaves a mess that only God can sort out. And that, I think, is the key message for this week, is that because risk is when that pulling apart happens, is that hearts become hard, and unless it's not an easy process to sort this out. And that's why I say, in one way, you need an expert physician to be able to help these people who've gone through these scenarios. I mean, we need an expert physician in every part of our life, but we're talking about the messiness of life with particularly divorce and adultery and having been ripped apart when two have become together. It's the grace and forgiveness that comes from what Jesus gave to us on the cross that is crucial for restoration, sanctification and salvation, and to see people restored, people that have been broken, and to produce something wonderful, something beautiful out of what might seem to be ashes. So I pray that you would have received something from this message this week, and that it would have been a blessing to you, and that you would have been brought closer towards Jesus, a different kind of understanding, perhaps challenged in one way. Just realise that walk through these things with Jesus in prayer. You may have to wrestle perhaps sometimes, but stick with it. The rewards far outweigh the losses in the end. So until next week or next time, I pray a blessing on each of you who have listened to this message, and that you will know God's grace in your life. Amen.